What's up, everybody? So in this video, we're going to be talking about the final thing in this chapter, which is birth, hormones and birth. We know that in order for this whole reproductive system thing to happen, the whole reproduction process, we need to make a spermie, right, through spermatogenesis. And we need to make an eggy through oogenesis, or like an egg, right? And then this egg and the sperm needs to come together in a process called fertilization, where they form a cell called a zygote. This zygote is going to multiply and multiply by mitosis in pregnancy to form a baby. Now, we can't just leave the baby in the mother, right? It's got to leave in a process called birth, right? And birth doesn't just happen by magic. There's a lot of hormones and things involved that causes it to happen, right? So that's exactly what we're going to talk about in this video. Now, as usual, let's have a quick overview so we're all on the same page, and then everything in this video will make perfect sense. So what do we have here? Tell me right now. We've got the female reproductive system. So we're going to slice it open to see what's going on the inside, right? So usually what happens is what? We first start with the egg. Where is the egg made? Right here, right? We call this the ovary. So I'm just going to label this stuff so we're on the same page. The ovary. The ovary is then released where? Into this tube, which we call what? We call it the fallopian tube, or you can call it the oviduct. Okay, you can put it here, fallopian tube or oviduct. Now, meanwhile, okay, there's two things that can happen. You can either get a sperm or you cannot. Maybe you have a boyfriend, maybe you don't. Okay, so let's say there's a man involved. So let's say spermie gets in. Where does sperm go into first? The very first part, the part that connects to the outside world. We call this the vagina, right? This little section here, short section here. Now, once sperm is in, it's got to pass through this narrow area here. What do we call this narrow area? We call it the cervix. Now, bear in mind, this cervix is very important in birth. So remember this name, cervix. So it passes through the cervix, this narrow portion here, and it goes into this huge chamber here. Well, at first, it's not that big, right? It's not that big at first, but still bigger than the rest, right? So we can call this the uterus. So it's in the uterus now. Now, it doesn't stay in the uterus. It goes and chases the lady. It goes chases the egg. And eventually, it meets the egg, and they form a zygote, right? They fertilize each other. Now, let's pretend this is the zygote. The zygote will duplicate and duplicate to form a bigger clump of cells, which we call the blastocyst. The blastocyst is going to come into the uterus and implant into this wall here. This wall. What do we call this wall? The endometrium. The endometrium, this little red wall here. This little red wall is full of a lot of vessels that are going to provide nutrients for this blastocyst to grow and multiply into a full-grown baby, right? So that's the big idea. But we're missing one key thing. What is this little brown layer here? This is the myometrium. This is muscle, like the muscle in your arms when you contract and move them. So this little area can contract and cause movement. And we'll see why this is very important. Okay? So this is the overall idea, an overview of how reproduction happens. So we're going to skip ahead now to a time where the baby is all developed. Okay, let me show you. So here we have it. Here we have the mother, okay? And we have this huge little thing. What is this? What is this? This is still the female reproductive system, right? Remember here I showed you the uterus, this little area here. This is where the baby is going to grow. But when the baby gets bigger and bigger, this whole thing gets stretched out and gets stretched out and stretched out until it's really huge. And that's what we're seeing here. This little area that the baby is in is just the uterus. It's just severely stretched out. And we can see this little brown muscle layer, right? It's the same thing here, this little brown muscle layer. So it's just huge and stretched out. Remember this, the baby doesn't develop by itself. It develops along with this placenta, right? Placenta. So this clump of cells that implant into the endometrium will develop into a placenta and a baby, right? So the placenta connects to the baby with this umbilical cord. And the placenta was important for two reasons, right? The one was, it was a little organ, a little thing that is going to put nutrients from the mother into the baby, and it's going to take waste from the baby and put it back into the mother. So it was very important in this exchange between the mother and the baby. But it also had another function called the endocrine function. So endocrine just means hormones, and you'll see why these hormones are important regarding birth later in this video. So that's the big idea here. So we skip now all the way to 9 months, right? Right before the baby is born. By the way, here's a little picture of a placenta and the umbilical cord and some key details about it. But don't worry, I made a whole video on placenta, so you can go check that out. Okay, so what now? Why? So we reached now 9 months. So let me show you another picture here. So after 9 months, a lot of things are going to happen. A lot of hormones are going to be made, stimulating a key process called labor. So what is labor? You've probably heard about this many, many times, right? So labor is a process, a time when the uterine contractions begin until delivery. Okay, so we can put it until maybe. Okay, so what do I mean by uterine contractions? So remember these muscles. These are uterine muscles. So, by that logic, labor is a time when those muscles begin to contract. Why would they contract? When they contract, what they're doing is they're trying to make this space smaller. When they contract, it's going to try and squeeze on this space. And remember, the big baby is in here. So when these muscles contract and squeeze on the baby's got nowhere to go except out this hole, out the vagina and through the cervix, right? That's all. That's the only place it's got to go. So that's very important. So these uterine contractions are going to force this baby out until it is fully delivered. That's what labor is. Now, labor, like I said, doesn't happen by itself. It needs hormones and things to stimulate it. So we're going to talk about those things right now. So here we have a picture. Okay? Again, we're looking at the inside here of the female reproductive system, and we've got a big baby here. Okay? We're going to pretend this whole uterus thing is stretched out and the baby is huge. Okay? But for the sake of this picture, I'm going to keep it like this. It's easy to explain. But we got to remember, in reality, when the baby is there, this whole thing is stretched out and everything is really big. Okay, so just remember that. This is not a 100% realistic image. Okay, so how does this whole thing happen? How does this labor happen that I just talked about? Let me show you. One sec, I just gotta write something down so I remember to tell it to you later. Okay, so how does it happen? So you know this endometrium that I talked about? At around 9 months, it's going to start making a little molecule called prostaglandins. Okay, prostaglandins is a little molecule that is that's whole job is to go to this muscle, this myometrium I've been mentioning, and it's basically going to tell it to do its job. It's going to tell it contract, contract, contract. And that's important because, like I said, when it contracts, it's going to try and squeeze this baby out of this hole, out into the world. But to be honest, this prostaglandins, it does a good job at telling the muscle, but it's not strong enough. It doesn't do a good enough job to completely get out the baby. So something else has to happen. Okay, what else happens? So remember how I said that this baby is so huge that it's causing this whole thing to stretch open. Now inside here, there's a lot of little molecules that can sense this stretching. It can feel the stretching, okay? Let me show you. So let's pretend there's a lot of molecules that can feel this stretching. We call them stretch receptors. And what they're going to do is they're going to basically send a signal to the brain, specifically a part of the brain which we call the hypothalamus. Okay, it's somewhere inside here, somewhere inside the brain. Now the hypothalamus is going to tell another part of the brain, which we call the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is like somewhere here in the small circle, and it looks like this, like a little ball sack, but it's not a ball sack. Okay, so the hypothalamus will tell this pituitary gland to release a molecule. Okay, but first let me label something. So we got the pituitary gland here. Okay, there's an anterior and a posterior part because this is the front of the brain, this is the back of the brain. So we call this the anterior pituitary, and posterior pituitary. It's basically a little gland that can secrete a lot of hormones, okay? Now, different hormones are secreted from the anterior part than are secreted from the posterior part. That's why they have two different names. Okay, so now the stretch receptors tell the hypothalamus, because basically if there's a big stretch, it tells the brain that the baby is ready to come out. This thing is stretching so much, it's time, the baby is big enough. And then the brain is going to tell the posterior pituitary, so this little part here, so the back part, to release a molecule called oxytocin. Okay, we're going to pretend this little thing here is oxytocin. Now, oxytocin has a key job. Very similar to the prostaglandins. It's going to go to this muscle and tell it to contract, 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 contract. And that's exactly what it does. Now, guess what? Every time, initially, the contractions are small because there's a little bit of oxytocin, a little bit, not that much. But every time it contracts, this cycle repeats. So there's every time it contracts, there's going to be a lot of stretch, a lot of like tension. And so the cycle will repeat and more oxytocin will be made. So initially, there's mild contraction. And then there's going to be feedback. There's going to be made more oxytocin and more oxytocin. When we have a process that stimulates more and more and more and more, we call this positive feedback. It's like when your parents tell you good job on something, right? You're like, oh, you did a good job. Then you're going to do more of that, right? Because you want to impress them. Or you want to, when your friend tells you, damn, you bench a lot, you're going to work harder and you're going to try and bench more. Or you run fast and you're going to try and run faster. It's the same thing here. When oxytocin does its job and there's this signal sending it back, being like, yeah, do more of that. We call that positive feedback. So this is a positive feedback cycle. So more and more happens. And this is important. That's why the contractions go from mild to very strong. You can see the female, when a woman gives birth, it seems very painful. Initially, it's not, but then it gets more and more painful and more intense because of this positive feedback causing more and more contractions, okay? So this, guess what? Let's turn the baby around to make it realistic. Normally it's head first. It doesn't have to be, but normally it is. So let's say that we go head and it's gonna get squeezed and squeezed because it's got nowhere to go except out this area here. What do we call this area here? Do you remember? The cervix, this narrow area here. So it's very important by this logic that something happens, that the cervix widens. So when this baby is squeezed, the cervix will go wider and wider and wider because the baby's head's got to go through it. So the baby's going to go through and the cervix is going to widen. Okay, so it's going to widen and the baby's head's going to go through, and then ultimately there's going to be a lot of contraction. And remember how the baby is surrounded by a little sac. I don't know if you can't see in this image so well, but it's surrounded by a little sac. And in the sac, there's the baby and a bunch of fluid called amniotic fluid. And we call this sac the amniotic sac. Now, when this whole contraction process is happening, we're squeezing down. So we're going to pop this bag. We're going to pop this amniotic sac. So what happens is the amniotic sac is going to break in this process. And remember, there's a bunch of amniotic fluid inside, a bunch of liquid. And this liquid is going to go out that hole and out, and it's got nowhere to go except out here, out through the vagina. So we call that, you know, in movies, how when there's like a scene of a woman about to give birth, they call it that the water is breaking. A lot of water suddenly leaves and it's on the floor. The baby is still inside, the female, but the water is on the floor. That's called water breaking, right? And the fancy way of knowing what's happening here is in fact that the amniotic sac that the baby is in broke and the fluid inside is released into the environment. And that's because of this whole contraction process. Right, so we know now why that is. So now let's say this continues, the baby eventually goes out, right? Through this whole crazy cycle of contractions. Now, not only this happens. Oh yeah, so let me label this. So this oxytocin is going to cause uterine muscle contractions, just like the prostaglandins. Now, after birth, something very important happens. The brain, specifically now, the anterior pituitary is going to release a molecule, not the posterior, now the anterior, okay? It's going to release a molecule called prolactin, okay? Prolactin. Now, guess what prolactin is? What does the baby want to do after it's born, right? It's got to eat, it's got to get some milk. So prolactin is a little hormone released from the anterior pituitary that's going to go to the female's breast, okay? And it's going to tell it to make milk, So it's going to do milk production. It's going to tell these, you see this breast, right? This is the nipple in the front. This is the ribs here. These are the ribs you can see the ribs. And this is fat, this yellow stuff, and these little things here are glands. And these glands make milk. And after the glands make the milk, they secrete it through these little pipes out the nipple, right? So prolactin is a molecule released from the anterior pituitary that's going to act on these glands and make them make more milk. Make them make milk because the baby needs it. It doesn't make it secrete the milk. It only makes the glands make milk. Okay, so we need something else to cause these glands to secrete the milk. Guess what that is going to be? That's going to be oxytocin. So oxytocin has two jobs. Not only does it cause this muscle contraction, like this whole thing, but it also causes milk secretion. So prolactin is going to make sense, lactase for milk, okay? And we call this lactation. Okay, the process of making milk is called lactation. I can try and write it here. Lactation, okay? Just because I forgot to write it. So the process of making milk is called lactation. Now, after the milk is made, this molecule doesn't make it secrete the milk. It's just going to be stored here. But oxytocin is being made in the meanwhile, right? And it has two jobs. Not only does it cause contraction, it can also go here and tell these glands to finally release it. Okay? Now the baby, guess what? Is going to go and drink the milk. Let me visualize this for you. Yeah. It goes, it drinks the milk. Now, the process of sucking on the nipple is very important, actually. It causes positive feedback. Remember what positive feedback is? It means making more of something. It means continuing the process. So when the baby sucks on the nipple to get the milk out, it makes a positive feedback to make more prolactin and more oxytocin. so that more milk can be made and more can be secreted. So it's also another example of positive feedback. So ultimately, I have one more thing to show you. I hope this makes sense. This is the big, if you got all this, you pretty much nailed it. But one more thing I want to show you. So here I have the same process drawn out. Look here, same thing. It's just a bit more simple. I didn't put the anterior part, but same thing on this thing. Now, what I want to show you now is placenta. So remember the placenta had two jobs, right? And the one was endocrine, which was to make estrogen and progesterone. And these two hormones have very important jobs, one of which is to maintain the endometrium. The endometrium was the part supplying the that the placenta was in and supplying the baby to make it survive, right? And to make the baby stay inside the uterus. Now, guess what? After birth, the placenta stops making these hormones. I mean, before birth, right before birth, like 9 months, it stops making these hormones. So guess what's going to happen? If these hormones are not there anymore, then there's going to be no more maintaining of the endometrium. And the endometrium is the part that the placenta is stored in, like attached to. Remember how I said that when you give birth, right? When this baby is giving birth, right? It comes out, but remember, the baby is attached by an umbilical cord to a placenta, which is attached to the endometrium, and they're nailed in hard. So how come can the baby come out and the placenta is still there? Well, that's the thing. In fact, when the baby comes out, it is still attached to the placenta by this umbilical cord, which is why when the baby comes out, it will have an umbilical cord attached to it. And the placenta will also come out. Why does the placenta come out? I thought it was attached to here. That's a great question. Remember now, here I said, these hormones maintain the endometrium. And if the endometrium is maintained, then the placenta will be stuck there. It'll be rigid and tight there. But remember, right before, at around 9 months, the placenta stops making these hormones, which means the endometrium is not being maintained. If the endometrium is not being maintained, the placenta will no longer be attached to it. The endometrium will kind of stop doing its job, and so the placenta will start detaching. So if the placenta starts detaching, then when you give birth to the baby, along with the baby will come the umbilical cord and eventually the placenta. When the placenta comes out, they kind of call it the afterbirth, because it is the second thing coming that is birthed out or given birth to after the baby. So that's important to understand, okay? So that's why the placenta doesn't stay there. It comes out because of this fact that these hormones are not maintaining the endometrium anymore, and so the placenta can easily detach, okay? That's basically it. And also, when progesterone drops, notice what happens. Normally, its job is to prevent uterine contractions, preventing these contractions, preventing the baby from getting squeezed out. But because the placenta stops making these hormones, there's less progesterone. With less progesterone, there is less preventing of the uterine contractions, meaning the uterine contractions will happen. So that's another way in which these contractions are stimulated, okay? And remember also, progesterone, you'll see in another video of mine, progesterone is one of its jobs is to inhibit pregnancy by inhibiting LH and FSH. You'll probably see that in the menstrual cycle video. But now that its level is dropping because the placenta isn't making it anymore, now you can get pregnant again. That's why you cannot when you're pregnant, you cannot get pregnant again. But when you get birth, now this progesterone level dropped and now you can get pregnant again. So I hope this whole thing made as much sense as possible, and that you get the whole process. Now we have just this diagram, which I'll spend like a minute going over, just because it's technically in the books. So notice here we have concentration of hormones on the left, this y-axis, and then x-axis, the time, right? So we can see in the beginning of pregnancy, HCG is increased. Remember, HCG is made by what? The corpus luteum. Corpus luteum makes HCG so that estrogen and progesterone can be made by the corpus luteum, right? So HCG is made to stimulate the corpus luteum to make estrogen and progesterone. So their levels will go up. After a while, HCG will start dropping because why? Because the placenta takes over the job of the corpus luteum, right? Because HCG, the whole job of it was to stimulate the corpus luteum to stay alive. But eventually the corpus luteum dies, so HCG levels will drop. But estrogen and progesterone will continuously go up because the placenta took over the job to make estrogen and progesterone. And around birth, the levels will suddenly start plummeting. Notice they start plummeting. And this allows birth to happen effectively and all that. And we have prolactin that was made, remember, which helps milk production. And look at this, it goes crazy, up and down, up and down. That's because the levels will slightly vary depending when the baby is drinking, when the baby is sucking on the nipple and when it's not, right? So it's going to vary on the level throughout the time, but it's going to be constantly elevated. So that's it. I hope this overall like diagram makes sense, and it should make sense if you understood all the previous parts that I was talking about. So that's it for this whole unit. It was a long one, but it's done now, and I hope everything makes sense as much as possible. If it doesn't, comment and let me help you.